David Schindler called me and suggested very strongly that I accept the invitation to this conference, and he's one of my real eco-heroes. So when this guy calls, there's nothing you can do but say yes, thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, but looking over the crowd, it's quite different from what I originally thought. I thought it was going to be a room full of scientists, and that's why I gave the title that I did. But seeing the participants, you guys know much better than I do about this subject, and I thought what I'd rather do then is to forget that title of my talk and try to provide you with a context within which you can carry out your discussions and deliberations in the coming time. So if you'll excuse me, I'm not going to talk about what scientists have to do in order to get the message out. Scientists think that human beings as a species, Homo sapiens sapiens, arose on this planet about 100,000 years ago. And in evolutionary time, in the 4 billion years that life has been on this planet, that means we've appeared very suddenly, very recently. We're an infant species on this planet. And I often think if scientists from somewhere else in the universe, some other galaxy, long ago began to search the universe to try to find evidence for life somewhere else in the universe, and let's say 100,000 years ago they discovered our solar system and discovered planet Earth and parked their spaceship high above the African continent and gazed down, what would they see 100,000 years ago? They would have seen the Serengeti covered in animals as magnificent as the wildebeest and lions and giraffes that we see, plus a whole host of others that may have gone extinct, all kinds of creatures and plants in that vast ecosystem. And here and there they would have seen small little groups of hairless, naked, two-legged animals kind of running around, and that was us. Now, if they looked down over those animals and plants, I don't think they would have pointed to those naked critters and said, watch those ones, they're the ones of destiny. I mean, we weren't very big, we weren't very fast, we weren't very strong, we didn't have great acuity in our senses, our eyes, our smell, our hearing. We sure as hell weren't as beautiful as the flamingos or coho salmon. So, not much to distinguish us as a special creature. But if they watched that animal, if they had seen those early humans and watched them, they would have realized there was something different about them. And that difference, of course, couldn't be seen in our appearance because the key to our survival was that 2-kilogram organ that was stuck in our skulls, the human brain. They would have seen our behavior indicated that we had intelligence. The human brain was a secret to our survival in competition with so many other more impressive animals on the planet. We were gifted by that human brain with a tremendous curiosity. That brain made us very creative. We were inventive. We had a huge memory. And the French Nobel Prize winner, François Jacob, said many years ago, the human brain has an inbuilt need for order. We don't like disorder or chaos because it's frightening. Nothing makes sense. So what the human brain does is always try to find meaning, try to find understanding so that we can begin to explain what's going on around us. And we integrate then all of our observations and our insights and our guesses into what anthropologists call a worldview. A worldview is a collective knowledge of all of that particular people, and in a worldview, everything is connected to everything else. That's why throughout time, if a woman gave birth to a two-headed child, or someone was out hunting and comes across a deer with a strange growth on its side, they didn't just say, oh, well, that was just a fluke, that was just an accident. They paid a lot of attention to it. They said, wow, could that be punishment for something we did in the past? Or is it a warning that something is coming in the future? Because in a worldview, everything is connected to everything else. That's the way it's always been. And through that worldview, human beings invented something no one else, no other species has. And that's a future. The future doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is right now, what we've got. But the human brain invented this thing called a future. And because we have a sense of a future, human beings, alone among all species, have choice. We realized that we could choose the kind of future we go to by deliberately selecting from a group of options. If I go that way, there's something good to eat. If I go that way, there are saber-toothed tigers that'll jump on me and eat me. So I'm going to go that way. That's the way humans survived. They put it all together. They chose among options the path that would give them the highest chance of survival. And even today, if you, as I've been fortunate to do, visit Aboriginal people all over the world, if you visit traditional people, and if you listen to the stories they tell, the songs they sing and the prayers they give, it's all about celebrating who we are and where we belong in this world. It's all about thanking the Creator for nature's generosity and abundance. They're all about acknowledging that because we are a part of nature, we have responsibilities. And we promise continually that we will try to act the right way to keep it all going. That's how it's always been. And for many people, that's the way it still is. But suddenly, in the dominant societies of the world, that sense of interconnectedness has been shattered. And we now live in a world that's been fragmented into bits and pieces. When we live in a world of fragments, we no longer see how they are all connected together. You know, we go out today and we shop in a Gap store or go for Nike shoes, and nobody ever says, gee, I wonder where they grew the cotton that went into this product or the rubber that went into it. I wonder what the conditions were where they got these materials. What about the people that worked to harvest the material and put it all together? We don't ask those kinds of questions. We go out, we buy a car, a television, or a computer. We don't say, gee, there are dozens and dozens of metals and other materials in these products. Where did they come from? What were the conditions that they were mined out of the earth? What were the working conditions and the pay of the people that did that mining and assembling of these products? We want a TV set. We got the money, we go out and buy it, and yet we don't realize that there are enormous repercussions of that act of laying down money and buying the product. But if we live in a shattered world, we no longer see or even care about those interconnections. And I came to realize in a very profound way what happens when you don't see the connections. Because when you no longer see interconnections, we no longer see that there are causal relationships. If I do this, that could happen. If I don't do this, that might happen. Those are causality. That's causality. Those are cause and effect relations. If we see bits and pieces, but no connections, then there's no cause and effect. And that means there's no responsibility, because you don't see how we are having the consequences out there. And I came to realize that a few years ago when I decided that we had to do a program on asthma. Now, I was born in 1936 in Vancouver, and when I was a child growing up, nobody knew what asthma was. My parents had never even heard the word asthma. Asthma was something doctors knew as rare medical conditions. First time I ever saw or met a person with asthma was in my last year of university. He couldn't take phys ed, and I thought, God, that's a wimpy disease. And then I was humiliated, ashamed of myself when I saw, for the first time a few years after that, a child in a full-blown asthma attack, and realized the child was suffocating right in front of my eyes. And what has happened today, you can't go into a classroom anywhere in this country and not find all kinds of children with puffers. 1 out of 5 children in Canada today will grow up with asthma. It's an epidemic. And that's why I decided to do a film about asthma. And one of the things we said is, let's wait for a smog alert day in Toronto, and you don't have to wait very long in Toronto for that. And we'll go down to the emergency ward and film what happens. So smog alert came out, rushed down to Toronto General. it was jammed with old people and kids having severe asthma attack. And people would roar up to the emergency door, worried sick that their loved one was going to die. They would do anything to save their parent or their child that they had brought in. If you said, cut off your right finger, the finger on your right hand, they would do it right away in order to save their child's life. And yet, many of them drove up to that emergency ward in a sports utility vehicle. And that, to me, said it all. They cared, they loved their children or their parents, they would do anything to protect them, and yet they do not recognize that the very act of owning and driving a sports utility vehicle is contributing to the crisis that they're trying to deal with in the hospital. So if we don't see the interconnectedness of everything, then whatever we do is no longer relevant to the kinds of issues that we're confronting. And I believe this is the greatest challenge that we face today, that we no longer see the connectivity. Now, why is that? Today, we're so highly educated as a society. We've got scientists and engineers, we've got global telecommunications, we've got computers and the internet. How is it that with all of this information and education, we've lost the sense of interconnectivity that traditional peoples have always had? And I think it's the reflection of the coming together of a number of factors over the last 100 years that make it much more difficult to see those interconnections. One of the most obvious things is population. Human beings have become the most numerous mammal on the planet. There are more of us than all of the great herds of wildebeest, than all the caribou, than all the rabbits and mice and rats. Humans are the most numerous mammal on the planet. And it's happened very, very suddenly. If we've been around for 100,000 years, it took 99% of that 100,000 years to reach the first 1 billion people on Earth in the early 1800s. When I was born in 1936, there were 2 billion people on Earth. Suddenly, in my lifetime, the population of the planet has more than tripled. And if you were to graph that on a curve, you would see it's in the last pencil width of time, the curve is suddenly going straight up. Populations are climbing, and nothing in the world can continue to climb that way indefinitely. There's got to be a limit, and then that population will crash. But I don't want to talk about that. What has happened with this explosive growth in population, and you see this in a very pronounced way on reserves across this country. The vast majority of people on Earth today were born after 1950. And what does that mean? It means that you have spent your entire lives in an absolutely abnormal, unprecedented, and unsustainable period of growth and change. But because you've spent your entire lives since 1950 in that period, to you it's normal. Most people in the world think this is the way it's always been and this is the way it's got to keep going. And the curves are all leaping straight up off the page, whether it's technology, consumption, whatever it is, going sky high. And everybody, because most people were born in that last pencil width of time, people think this is what we've got to keep working to grow. And that blinds us then to the reality, if you look at us over the last 100,000 years, that this is a very abnormal blip, and it simply can't go on. It must be brought into some kind of balance. So population, the nature of a rapidly growing population is most of the populations are young, and young people, the young population, reflects only what they've known in their lifetimes. We also live in a period in the last 100 years when science and technology have exploded. And science itself, the vast bulk of science, is based on a process of what's called reductionism. Reductionism means we focus on a part of nature. In my case, I spent 25 years as a geneticist looking at a fruit fly in a test tube, but I wasn't interested in the fruit fly, I was interested in its genes and chromosomes. We focus on a part of nature, separate it from everything else, control everything impinging on that part of nature, measure everything in it, and then we acquire a great deal of knowledge about that isolated fragment. Now, the idea underlying reductionism in science is that if we focus on enough parts, then eventually we'll be able to fit them back together and reconstruct the whole. So the assumption has been ever since Isaac Newton's time that the world is like a giant machine. He called it a clockwork mechanism. And by studying the parts, we'll be able eventually to fit them together and understand the whole. Well, physicists showed long ago that this doesn't work. You may study the parts and know everything about them, but when you put them together, they interact. And they say emergent properties are observed. There are new properties that come out of the combination that you cannot predict on the basis of the isolated parts. But most biologists and doctors still function on the reductionist mode. I went in to see a lung specialist the other day because I was having bronchial problems. He doesn't even see me as a whole human being. All he knows is lungs. Just wants to check those lungs, sir. You know, that's the way doctors are. They just look at you at the parts that make you up. They never see the whole person. And it's the same thing in most of biology today. We're so focused. And the difficulty with that is, when a scientist is focused, we're not aware of the context within which what we're studying exists. We don't see where it all fits and where that part ramifies throughout the whole system. And that was very clear with DDT. DDT was first synthesized in the 1800s by organic chemists. It was only in the 1930s that a scientist named Paul Mueller discovered that DDT kills insects. And wow, did we think that was great. You know, we can apply science now and we can come to manage insect pests. And he won a Nobel Prize for this in 1948. But it was only years later, as DDT began to be used extensively, that bird watchers began to notice something funny was happening with birds. And scientists tracked it down and discovered something they didn't even know existed. It's called biomagnification. You spray DDT in parts per tens of millions, very low concentration. That's absorbed by bacteria that are not killed by it. They soak it up. They're eaten by bigger organisms, and at each level up the food chain, you concentrate it. And by the time you get to the fatty tissue in the shell glands of birds or in the breasts of women, you've concentrated DDT hundreds of thousands of times. Scientists didn't have a clue that there was a thing called biomagnification because we were too focused and didn't understand how real systems worked. It was only when eagles began to disappear that biologists discovered there was a thing called biomagnification. CFCs, same thing. CFCs, why are CFCs important? They're big ring molecules and they've got a lot of chlorine stuck on them. Now, chlorine is a very reactive compound. Chlorine is involved in the synthesis of DDT and CFCs and dioxins and PCBs, a very reactive compound. But for some reason, when you stick chlorines into a CFC, they're chemically inert. So you have a big molecule and it doesn't react chemically with anything. All right, who cares? Well, when you're putting material into an aerosol spray can, let's say you're going to put underarm deodorant in there. You don't fill the whole can with underarm deodorant. You don't need it. So you just put a little bit in the bottom. But if you fill the rest of it with air, air is filled with oxygen and nitrogen that are chemically reactive. They break down the underarm deodorant, so it's no good. But if you put a little bit of underarm deodorant, then you fill it up with CFCs. CFCs are big molecules, so you can fill it up really easy, but they're chemically inert. They don't react with the stuff. So it's great, right? So we start using CFCs by the millions and millions of pounds, and then suddenly people realize, oh my God, in the real world out there, because it's not chemically active, CFCs hang around, they're building up, they're floating higher and higher, and way above the earth, they discover that light, ultraviolet light from the sun, breaks chlorine-free radicals off the CFCs. And chlorine-free radicals are potent scavengers of ozone. So when scientists began to say, uh-oh, CFCs are breaking down the ozone layer, I said, what ozone layer? I'd never even knew that there was an ozone layer up there to break down. And mark my words, as you will be discussing in this province, genetically modified organisms are going to be exactly the same. Very powerful technology. No one's ever been able to flip genes from one species to another. We have no idea what the consequences will be. And absolutely, we're going to find out all kinds of things we didn't know. Because scientists are too focused, and we don't understand the implications out in the real world. We also live in a time of tremendous increase in information. And people like Bill Clinton and Jean Chrétien thought the information superhighway was great. This is going to be the age of information, and this is the future of information technology. I think this is baloney. The problem for the average person, we got too much information just flooding at us. It's coming at us from all areas, and we don't know what to make sense of it. Every time I talk about climate change, for example, always someone gets up and says, you're full of baloney. We're going into an ice age. Not global warming, we're going into global cooling. And I say, well, how do you know that? Well, I saw a website. There's a website that says that we're going. Well, of course there'll be a website. Who do you think's putting those websites together? The fossil fuel industry, of course. You want to find out about the flat Earth, that the Earth is flat? There's a Flat Earth Society website. You want to find out about Bermuda Triangles? You want to find out about UFOs that have, with extraterrestrials that have come down and raped women and had children? There's a website for it. You got to be more careful or critical about that. I remember a few years ago I gave a lecture in Toronto and this kid came down and said, what do you think of spontaneous combustion? And I said, well, I know that oily rags in your garage might spontaneously combust. He said, no, I'm talking about people. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, we're made up of all kinds of good stuff that burns, like hair and fat and sugar and fingernails. And with 6 billion people on Earth, a very small percentage achieve a metabolic state such that they spontaneously burst into flame and burn up. And I thought, gee, that doesn't make much sense to me as a biologist. But sure enough, I'm going through the airport, and there's a bookstore, and there's a book called Spontaneous Combustion. You look through it, there are pictures of Mrs. Smith in Akron, Ohio. You know, it's a pile of ashes, right? And the weird thing about it is spontaneous combustion never happens when someone else is in the room. You open it, oh my God, my wife burned up, but because now there's a book, people say, oh yeah, there's spontaneous combustion, I read it. Or they say, oh, I saw it on TV. Yeah, but did you see it on The Nature of Things? Or that's incredible. I mean, it depends. We got to be much more critical about information. I have to admit, I live and die on the 6 o'clock CBC radio news every evening. But you think about that, a half-hour news report, in that half hour there may be 15 to 20 items. When the announcer says, and now we bring you an in-depth report, he's talking about a 2-minute report. What kind of issue can we have of any substance that would tell us about why this is happening, why you should care, what the context, what created this story, or even what you could do about it? None of that is in there. You just get a short blip that comes at you, a war in Bosnia, a genocide in Rwanda, a hurricane in the Caribbean, and with no sense that it makes any sense at all. So we're just fragmenting the world into bits and pieces. But I think the most powerful destructor or a disconnector is this thing we call the global economy. And the global economy is something we're told over and over again by our political leaders. Listen, if we don't have a strong growing economy, we can't afford to do all these other things. We can't afford proper medical care. We can't afford a clean environment and all this other stuff. And I was struck in an interview with Lauren Taylor, the Minister of the Environment in Alberta, that was reported in the Calgary Herald on September 5th. And listen to this. He was talking about me. He said, I think he's, meaning me, I think he's an old-style environmentalist who's outdated and outmoded. I think the new style of environmentalist is completely different. They understand that you have to have a strong economy in order to have a healthy environment, okay? Now you hear that. This is the Minister of the Environment saying in order to have a healthy environment, we have to have a strong economy. What has this guy been smoking? If you don't have a healthy environment, you don't have politicians or human beings, for God's sake. He's got it 180 degrees wrong. In order to even have an economy, you have to have an environment. This is nuts. But that's the conventional wisdom now, is that the economy is the source of everything that matters. And as long as the economy is healthy, then we can afford to have things like environment ministries and all of that stuff. Well, listening or reading that statement, you really have to wonder. He was, of course, Lorne Taylor. I've been a thorn in the side of Lorne Taylor and Ralph Klein because I went to his province many, many times to debate the Kyoto issue. And the argument has always been that we will not jeopardize the Alberta economy. Nothing must come before the Alberta economy. But wait a minute now. Canada is one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. Alberta is the richest province in Canada. And if they can't afford to do anything about climate change, who the hell else can? When do we get to a point where we can say, gee, maybe the atmosphere and all of the climate that's affecting us might be worth putting some effort into? How is it that a country far less wealthy than us, the United Kingdom, how is it that Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, can commit the United Kingdom to reducing greenhouse gases by 60% by the year 2050? And if the scientific information says it should be even more, he's willing to do that. How is it the European community is able to say we're going to beat the Kyoto target and go way beyond that? And there's Alberta saying we can't afford it. I speak a lot about the economy when I'm supposed to be talking about the environment. Well, I've never had a course in economics. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I just know what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. So I thought, well, maybe I should at least know some of the terms, what they mean in economics, so I can sound as impressive as economists do. So a few years ago, I decided, well, I think I better sit in on a course at UBC in economics. And since I'm a professor there, I get to do it for nothing. So I signed to audit the course. And the day of the first lecture, I was kind of excited about it, actually. And my wife said to me, listen, Suzuki, why don't you try not saying a word the whole class? Just listen. Maybe you'll learn. I said, okay. I won't say anything. So I sat there and listening to this guy. And sure enough, halfway through, he said, next slide, please. And it was a slide of the economy. That was really impressive. You know, there were arrows going all over the place, you know, raw materials, extraction, process, manufacture, wholesale, retail. And economists love these kinds of slides because they're trying to convince you they're scientists. Well, that's bullshit, of course. Economics is not a science, it's a set of values posing as a science with all this, you know, equations and stuff. Anyway, the idea is if you know what all the components of an economy are, then you can manage it by putting an incentive here or a disincentive there, and you can keep the economy going. And I told my wife I couldn't help it. The arm went up all by itself. I didn't mean to, but it said, excuse me, sir, on that graph, on that figure, where do you put the ozone layer? Where do you put the deep underground aquifers of fossil water that accumulate over thousands of years? Where do you put topsoil or biodiversity? And you know what his answer was? Anybody? There must be an economist or two in here. Those are externalities. I didn't know that meaning of the word externality. What it means is those have nothing to do with the economy. So you externalize the real world that we all live in, and you create this thing they call the economy. Well, you might as well be on Saturn, because it's got nothing to do with reality on this planet. That is the reason why people like Hazel Henderson, a futurist in the States, says conventional economics is a form of brain damage. These guys there's something really nutty about this. You build an economy and you externalize nature and the real world. That's crazy. Now, there is a group of people called ecological economists, and what they're trying to do is internalize what economists externalize. That is, put a value on things nature does. We call these ecosystem services. What does nature do for us? And what would it cost us if we had to do it ourselves, okay? Now, I have to tell you, I'm nervous about this. I don't like this, because I happen to think some things are sacred. And you can't put a value on sacred things. But as just a thought exercise, it may give us an idea of how much we're ignoring in this stupid economic system we have. So what Bob Constanza and his group at the University of Vermont have done is said, look, Vancouver gets its water by allowing the water to fall on 3 watersheds surrounded by old-growth forest. Now, the foresters say those big trees are worth a lot of money. We should just cut them down and make a filtration plant. So if we clear-cut all of these watersheds and built a filtering plant, what would it cost us? So that gives you a direct dollar value of what nature is doing for us for nothing. We can put a value on it. What would it cost us to try to pollinate all of the flowering plants on the planet? Well, we couldn't do it. I mean, it's been estimated on one sunny day, bees pollinate more than 1 trillion flowers in New York State. No way that humans could ever duplicate insects pollinating those things. What would it cost us if we had to take dead plants and animals and restore them back to the earth? That's what life does, composting it for us. But what would it cost us to do that? Could we build a plant to take carbon dioxide out of the air, put oxygen back in? So these are all services that nature does for us. And looking at that, Constanza estimates a crude figure of $33 trillion it would cost us to do what nature is doing for nothing. Now, to put this in perspective, at that time, this is several years ago, the total value of the annual GDPs of all of the countries in the world came to $18 trillion. So the human economy generates $18 trillion worth of goods and services, but nature is performing almost twice as much service, $33 trillion, that it would cost us to do that. And this is considered an externality. It's got nothing to do with the economy. Well, if that isn't a form of brain damage, you tell me what is. This is crazy, and no wonder we become so destructive. Then the stupidest thing is, we then say to economists, okay, this economy is great. How do we measure how well the economy is doing? You guys tell us. We let economists tell us the GDP. The gross domestic product, the annual exchange of goods and services involving money. That's the measure of the economy. Well, if you look at a GDP, you ever noticed anything funny about that? It only adds. They never ask, why are you paying this money? Let's suppose you live in a neighborhood where crime is growing, so you have to put locks on, and you have to have warnings, and you have to have a gun, and you have to have all this stuff. All of that adds to the GDP. So crime in your neighborhood's good for the economy. Ralph Nader says every time there's a car accident and someone gets killed, GDP goes up. He's absolutely right. In 1989, when the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened, the American GDP rose by $2 billion because that's what they spent cleaning it up. Well, we ought to spill oil all over the damn place. It's good for us. I mean, what a nutty concept, that it doesn't matter why you're spending money, as long as you're spending money for something, that's good for the economy, and it continues to rise. Now, the problem, the rot at the center of this economy is that economists think the best thing that ever happened on earth is us, human beings. Well, of course, all economists are human beings, so they must think they're great. Humans are so creative, we're so inventive, we're so productive, that the economy is based on that productivity. And since there's no limit to human productivity, creativity, then there's no limit to the economy. Economists believe the economy can grow forever, which it cannot. And they think it must keep growing forever. So that's all. No one ever asks, when the economy continues to grow like that, no one ever asks, wait a minute, how much is enough? I got so much stuff, I'm suffocating under it. Who needs all this stuff? Am I happier with all this stuff? What is an economy for? We don't ask those critical questions. Well, we better start asking those, because it's taking us right down the chutes. This commitment to the idea the economy has to keep growing indefinitely. You see, anything growing steadily over time is called exponential growth. Whether it's the amount of water you use, the amount of garbage you produce, the amount of land that you develop, whatever is growing steadily over time is called exponential growth. And it has a predictable doubling time. If it's growing at 1% a year, it'll double in 70 years. Okay? 2% a year, it'll double in 35 years. 3% in 24 years. 4% in 17 and a half years. Anything growing exponentially has a predictable doubling time. I'm going to give you a system analogous to the Earth. I'm going to give you a test tube full of food for bacteria. And I'm going to put one bacterial cell, that's us, represents us, into that test tube. And it's going to divide every minute. Okay? So at the time 0, at the beginning, there's one bacterium. 1 minute there are 2, 2 minutes there are 4, 3 minutes there are 8. That's exponential growth, right? And at 60 minutes, the test tube is completely full of bacteria and there's no food left. Okay? 60 minutes. When is the test tube only half full? Or half empty, depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist? Well, the answer, of course, is at 59 minutes. Even though you've been around for 59 minutes, it's only half full, but one more minute and it'll fill it, okay? 58 minutes, it's 25% full. 57 minutes, it's 12.5% full. At 55 minutes of a 60-minute cycle, it's only 3 minutes full. So if at 55 minutes, one of the bacteria said, hey guys, I think we got a population problem, the other bacteria would say, what the hell have you been drinking? 97% of the test tube is empty, and we've been around for 55 minutes. 5 minutes away from filling it. So they're no smarter than we are. At 59 minutes, they go, oh my God, Jack was right. We got a population problem. We got 1 minute left. Holy cow. We better give some more money to those economists. Give some money to those geneticists and those computer guys. And by God, they invent 3 test tubes full of food for bacteria in less than a minute. So they're saved, right? Quadruple the amount of food in space. And what happens? 60 minutes, the first test tube's full. 61 minutes, the second's full. 62 minutes, all 4 are full. By quadrupling the amount of food in space, you buy 2 extra minutes. How are we going to add even a % of more of air, water, soil, or biodiversity to the planet? We won't. And every biologist I've talked to agrees with me that we're already past the 59th minute. So everybody talking about the need for more, we got to have more, is accelerating what is the suicidal path. Now when I tell this to business people and politicians, they get really pissed off at me because they don't want to hear this. And they say, how dare you? You know, even in Saskatoon, you can go to stores and 12 months a year find fresh fruits and vegetables, and people are living longer and healthier. There have never been so many human beings. How can you say that we're past the 59th minute? Well, the reason is obvious. We're using up our biological capital. We're not living on the interest any longer, as people always did through the past. We're digging into our biological capital. We're using what rightfully belongs to our children and our grandchildren. We're using it up now. Now, any mediocre accountant will tell you, if you want to have a bank account that will live forever, you don't dip into the account, your capital. You leave that and you live off the interest. But we're using up the biological capital, which is the source of the interest that our children and grandchildren should be living on. So I would like to then leave you with that suggestion that we are long past the 59th minute. And every indication, every scientific indication is crystal clear on that. We use up more all over the world in a year than the earth itself can restore or replenish. That is not sustainable living. That is living on your capital. So I'd like to take us then, with that depressing point, on a different path. A path that offers much hope and opportunity, I believe. And I have to go way back to when I was in my last year of university. I was just starting my last year and at a school in Massachusetts called Amherst College, small school, and it was the fall of 1957. And I remember being electrified to hear on the radio that the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik. We didn't even know there was a space program. And if any of you are old enough to remember that time, you remember the Americans then tried to do the same thing. And in the agonizing months and years after that, their rockets kept blowing up before they got off the ground, or getting off the ground and then blowing up. And the Russians kept announcing one success after another. The first animal in space, Laika, a dog. The first human being in space, Yuri Gagarin. The first team of cosmonauts, the first woman. Over and over again, the Soviets were showing us that they were very advanced in science and technology. And so America decided to catch up, and they started to pour money into science. And even though I was a Canadian living in the States, I said, I like science. Boom, they gave you money. It was great. And I was taught, and I believed, that science is the most powerful way of knowing. Through science, we push back the curtains of ignorance. We reveal nature's deepest secrets, and we come to understand how nature works. Through science, we would acquire the power to manage the world around us, and life would get better and better. That's what I believed. That's what I taught my students when I began to teach as a professor. I came back to my first job in 1962 at the University of Alberta in the genetics department. And I was a hotshot man. I was going to go out and conquer the world and make my reputation. And I got totally sidetracked by a woman. Now that's happened to me ever since puberty. Usually it's been disastrous, but in this case, I'm ever grateful to her for what she did. No, she didn't do that. My greatest regret is that I never met her, but she had as great an effect on my life as any woman I've ever known. Her name was Rachel Carson. And in 1962, just as I was starting my career, in television as well that year, she published a book called Silent Spring, which was all about the impact of pesticides. Now, it's hard today to imagine the impact of that book. In 1962, there wasn't an environment department in any government anywhere on earth. The environment was not an issue. Rachel Carson made the environment a word that people paid attention to. And because of her, I, like millions of people around the world, was swept up in this great movement we now call the environmental movement. For me, her book spoke directly to me, and what it said was, hey, you scientists, you're really clever. You can make a thing like DDT. But what you do in the lab has nothing to do with the real world. In the real world, everything is connected. You spray to kill insects, but you end up affecting fish and birds and mammals, including human beings. And so I realized that a scientist could not just function in the lab playing our little games, that there was a greater responsibility to see the ramifications of what is going on out there in the real world. So I became swept up in British Columbia in the early protests against the American proposal to blow off nuclear bombs in Amchitka. Of course, they were no different then than they are now. They said, we don't care what you think, and went off and blew them up anyway, but it gave birth to Greenpeace in British Columbia. I remember protesting a dam at Site C on the Peace River, and we stopped that. I testified at a First Nations conference in Prince Rupert against offshore drilling for oil, and we stopped it. Now, 30 years later, we have a different government, and they want to drill for oil offshore and start that dam up again. So we live to fight these battles over and over. Of course, I started fighting against clear-cut logging, and that battle continues to this day, and against pollution from pulp mills and so on. To me, the problem was very simple. We are taking too much stuff out of the environment and putting too much back into it. And the solution then is we've got to regulate. You got to tell people what they can take and how much, and what they can put back as garbage or toxic material and how much. And then you enforce the regulations. So we were hammering politicians and saying, look, we need departments of the environment. We need to have Clean Air Acts and Clean Water Acts and Endangered Species Acts, and let's get on with it. But I began to realize by the early 1970s, this doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is we don't know enough to be able to manage the impact of all of our activities. I mean, I gave you the examples of DDT and CFCs. They clearly indicate we didn't know enough to manage them properly. So for me, this is a crisis. We're not going to stop science. We're not going to stop technology. How do we avoid problem after problem after problem? And the change in the way that I looked at this problem started in the late 1970s when I decided to do a film about the battle over logging in the Queen Charlotte Islands, or what the native people call Haida Gwaii. There had been a battle raging for years, and it came down to a 5,000-hectare watershed called Windy Bay. Forest industry wanted to go in and clear it, and environmentalists and native people said, no way, this is where we make our stand. And so I went in and interviewed environmentalists and CEOs of forest companies, politicians, loggers. And one of the people I interviewed was a man named Gu Zhao. Some of you may know him now as the president of the Haida Nation. But back then he was an artist and had led the fight against logging for many years. Now I knew that in the Haida communities of Skidegate and Masset, they had more than 80% unemployment. And many of the loggers were Haida. And the loggers shopped in the Haida stores and barbershops, and they injected money into their communities. So I said to Gu Zhao, why are you opposing logging when it's good economically for your people? And he said, sure, they can cut those trees down, and when the trees are all gone, we'll still be here. But when the trees are gone, we won't be Haida anymore, we'll just be like everybody else. I didn't even know what the hell he was talking about. But as I began to reflect on those words, I realized that here he had opened a window on a very different way of looking at the world. To me, he was saying being Haida means being connected to the land, that the air, the water, that the rivers, the fish, the birds, and the trees, all of that is what make the Haida special and different. That the land embodies their history, the culture, the very reason why Haida are on this world, on this earth, is told to them by their connection with the land. And you break that connection, and they're just like everybody else. And ever since then, I've been a student traveling to many parts of the world and meeting indigenous people. And everywhere it's the same. Many of you may have heard of Shishashi in Labrador, the Innu community, where you've seen these terrible pictures of children sniffing gasoline. I've been to Shishashi. I went out in the middle of winter with Elizabeth Penashu and her family and went camping. And even in that dysfunctional, very difficult community, the sense of connection to the land is still there. Aboriginal people all over the world refer to the earth as our mother. We heard it in the remarks before the conference opened today, and in the prayer. The earth is our mother, and they say that we are created by the four sacred elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And as I've reflected on these lessons, I realized that we've framed the problem the wrong way. There's no environment out there, and we are here, and we have to manage our interaction with it. We are literally the environment. We are the earth, because we are created by those elements that come from the earth. Now, as our elder indicated, air circulates right throughout us. We never even think about that. I was very moved when I interviewed Julie Payette, an astronaut, one of Canada's astronauts, who said, you know, when you're in a satellite circling the planet every hour and a half, it means 16 times a day you see a sunrise and a sunset. And every time you see a sunrise or sunset, they're way above the earth. Just above the earth, just a thin line, and that's the atmosphere. Below that is where life lives. That's 10 kilometers or so. And above that, there's nothing. It's a vacuum. That thin layer of air is what sustains us all. And if you were to reduce the earth to the size of a basketball, the atmosphere or the air would be thinner than a layer of saran wrap. And that's what we're breathing from, and that's what we're pumping all of this stuff into. And when you think about the air as it enters your body, we don't think about it very much because we do it 15 to 40 times a minute. We're pumping 1 to 3 liters of air into ourselves, and the air rushes into our lungs, which are filled with about 300 million little capsules called alveoli. We need all these alveoli to give the surface area to come into contact with the air. If you flatten the lungs out in 2 dimensions, all of these alveoli would cover a tennis court. So that's how much surface is all wrinkled up in our lungs. Each alveolus is lined with a 3-layered membrane called a surfactant. The surfactant reduces surface tension, so the air comes into your lungs and it instantly fuses to the surfactant. Carbon dioxide rushes out, and oxygen and nitrogen rush into our bodies. The oxygen is picked up by hemoglobin and red blood cells, and with each beat of the heart, the oxygen is pumped to every part of our bodies. The point is, there is no line that you can draw that says, the air ends here and I begin there. There is no line. We are air, it's in us, it's stuck to us, and it's circulating throughout our bodies. We say that we're intelligent. What intelligent creature, knowing that we are air, would proceed to use air as a toxic dump and think that it will simply go away? I calculate at my age I've taken at least 350 million breaths. And I've taken that air into my lungs and filtered whatever is in it. We are air, and whatever we do to the air, we do to ourselves. And why do we think we have an epidemic of asthma among our young people today? We are the air. And our children have become the canaries in the coal mine to tell us that we're not treating the air the proper way. We are water. I don't know where our elder got the figure 98% water. It's different from mine, but I'll bow to the elder. My calculations are we are 60 to 70% water. We're basically a big blob of water, but there's enough organic material there, thickener, so that we don't dribble away on the floor. But we are basically water. And of course, the water that's in our bodies doesn't stay in our bodies because we leak water all the time. It comes out of our skin and our eyes and our nose and our mouth and our crotch, and we're losing water all the time. But the amazing thing is our bodies know that. We don't have a big gauge here that says what the water level is. Oh, we're getting low, you better drink. No, our bodies know that. If we drank 1 milliliter of water more every day than we lose, in a matter of weeks we would blow up, right? If we drank 1 milliliter of water less a day than we lose, we'd just shrivel away. But we don't, because our bodies are constantly monitoring the level of water, telling us whether to drink some more or get rid of it. And when we take a drink of water, do you think this is Saskatoon water? I mean, water, the first science lesson I remember from school was the water cycle. Water covers 70% of the earth. Water evaporates, forms clouds, rains on the land, runs into rivers and lakes, evaporates. Water cartwheels around the planet. This water has molecules that have come from all the oceans of the world, that have come from the rainforests of the Amazon and Africa and Papua New Guinea, that have come from the steppes of Russia and the prairies of Canada. Water is like air. It's a glue that binds us all together. And we have become a part of the hydrologic cycle. We, as all other life forms, then are part of what absorb the water and release that water to go back up into the atmosphere. We are water. And whatever we do to the water, we do to ourselves. And this is one of the confusing things to me as I watch the deliberations that are going on in Ottawa today about the future of healthcare. It's all about delivering services and about having shorter waits, lineups, and paying for drugs. Nobody ever says, hey guys, we are the air we breathe. We are the water we drink. We are the earth through the food we consume. And whatever we do to those things, we're doing to ourselves. And if we are unhealthy, maybe it's a reflection of what we're doing to the earth, because we are the earth. I don't hear anybody talking about that. We are the earth. Whatever we do to it, we do to ourselves. And that, it seems to me, should become the context within which these deliberations are going on. We live in a world in which everything is connected to everything else, in which life flourishes because of the sacred gifts of clean air, clean water, clean soil, and clean energy that comes from the sun, and the diverse mix of species that cleanses the air. All the green things are cleansing the air, that filters the water and cleanses it, that creates soil and is the food that we eat, that captures sunlight so that we can get the energy by eating plants or animals that eat plants. Surely, Mr. Taylor better look at things again and realize that's the bottom line. If we have those things, clean air, water, soil, energy, and biodiversity, then we have the opportunity to have a healthy economy. I've become known through the years as the doctor of doom and gloom. Oh God, here comes Suzuki again with all this depressing stuff. Who wants to listen to this guy? So a few years ago, I realized that many people have heard my message. They know we're in trouble, but they feel that there's nothing they can do. So I began a project to find out whether there are concrete solutions. Are there things we can do to address the issues of climate change, of delivering clean water, of protecting biodiversity on the earth, of carrying out mining or fishing the proper way? When I started researching for this, I told Holly Dressel, my co-author, I said, gee, I hope we can get more than just a skinny little book, because I didn't know whether there would be many examples. To my amazement, we could have written many, many volumes. We called it Good News for a Change, Hope for a Troubled Planet. And the good news is there's lots of good news out there. People, organizations, governments, industries that are doing things that are getting us onto the right path. The bad news is our so-called leaders in business and politics don't seem to be very interested. I sent a copy of Good News for a Change to every politician in Ottawa, to every premier in the country, and to the CEOs of the 100 largest companies in Canada. And I said, don't bother thanking me, but if you're interested or want to look at this in more detail and do something, write to me. And the sad thing is, I didn't get many letters. People don't want to change. So that's why we decided at my foundation, the David Suzuki Foundation, we've got to show our leaders that we're individuals, we're about change. We can't wait for them. We've got to start doing things ourselves. So I got together with a group called the Union of Concerned Scientists, a very good group in the United States, and said, where do ordinary people impact the most on nature? What is our greatest impact? And it turns out very quickly, they said 3 areas: what we eat, how we move, and where we live. So food, housing, and transportation are the 3 areas where every one of us has an impact. And focusing on those 3 areas, we came up with a list of the 10 most effective things that each of us can do to try to reduce our impact on nature. We've called this the Nature Challenge, and what we're trying to do is get as many people as possible to sign up and agree to do at least 3 of the 10 things in the coming year. Now, we've been doing this for over a year. We have more than 100,000 people signed up, including the mayors of more than 24 cities, includes the mayor of Halifax, Winnipeg, well, former mayor of Winnipeg, Vancouver. Entire city councils of Vancouver and Halifax have signed up to do this. My hope is we can get 1 million Canadians to sign up, because I'll tell you what, not only will that have a measurable effect on the earth, but when we get 1 million people, and I go to any politician and say 1 million Canadians are taking the Nature Challenge, what do you think? They'll have to say, me too. Even Stephen Harper will have to say, yeah, I think we should do something. That's how we're going to bring about change, when enough of us say, it matters to us and we're going to do something about it. Now, if we're going to bring about change, where are we going? And that's what's led our foundation on its latest project, which I'm very excited about. It's called Sustainability Within a Generation. And the problem is that politicians are too concerned with short-term impacts. Mr. Martin, you can bet, is primarily preoccupied with an election is going to come up in the next 18 months or 2 years. That's his focus. The business people are focused on the annual report or even the quarterly report. They can't look to where we're going. And nobody's asking, where the hell are we going? So what we've done in Sustainability Within a Generation is we've said, what do we want to be? Where do we want Canada to be in a generation? How about a Canada in which the air is clean and we no longer have epidemic levels of asthma? What about being able to drink from any river or lake in the country? What about being able to eat the fish regardless of where they come from without even worrying about it? And everybody agrees, yes, that's what I want. No more smog days, and yeah, those are what we want to have. Business people, politicians, they all agree. Now we've got the vision, we've got a target. Then we say, What has to be done in order to bring our current practices into alignment and get us to that target within the next 25 years? We're looking at the year 2030. And what do you know? When you break up our activities into 11 or 12 categories, transportation, food, etc., what you find is that if we begin now we have a target, so we know if I do or do not do this, will it get us closer or further away from that target? We've got a direction to move in, and that can determine our actions that within a generation can get us much closer to that vision that is truly sustainable. So now the challenge, I believe, is that deliberations like this have to restore that vision of what we're doing and where we want to go, and let's get on with it. Thank you very much.